My name is Stacy Winchester, and I'm the Research Data Librarian at the University of South Carolina. My job is helping researchers preserve, share, and find data for research. I'll let Amy introduce herself, and then I'll tell you just a little bit about our department and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. I'm Amy Freeman. I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian, also in the Digital Research Services Department. And I work a lot with open access and open publishing, and also with digital scholarship projects. And I am excited to be talking to you today. So I will turn it back to Stacy.
Yeah, I'll say I'm happy to be here too, and thanks to each of you for being here. So as Amy mentioned, she and I are members of a department in the library that's called Digital Research Services. Our department exists to help researchers at USC, faculty or students or even staff doing research, conduct research throughout the project lifecycle. And today we're going to introduce some ways that you can use open access materials and maybe a couple of open source products in your classroom or individually with students, and why that might be useful, why you might want to consider doing so.
But if you are here today, you're probably already familiar with open access to some extent, but I want to make sure that we're all on a common baseline before we really dig in. So quickly, I'm going to give a few terms that I'll be using, and I promise I'm not going to be a dictionary this whole session, but just a couple to kick us off. So open access is the free online availability of published research. Usually that's coupled with the rights to use these works in certain ways in the digital environment. And open access can happen in a couple of different ways. So the first situation which open access can occur is in gold open access. And that happens when an author publishes their work in a journal that makes the final version of that article immediately free to access and then reuse in specific ways for anybody just as soon as it's published. Sometimes this is associated with author processing charges, or APCs, but it's also sometimes sponsored by institutions, scholarly societies, or libraries that do allow authors to publish without charges. Along those lines, there's also hybrid open access, and that's a publishing model in which subscription-based journals, like those that we subscribe to here at the library, allow authors to make individual articles within that journal gold open access immediately by paying an author processing charge, but still charge for access to the content otherwise. On the other hand, we have green open access, and green open access happens when an author publishes their work in any journal at all, even one of those subscription journals that charge for access, and then self-archives a copy in some sort of freely accessible repository. So you've seen these things like Archive or PubMed Central. So these works are generally still subject to copyright restrictions, and they're only free to reuse if they meet certain conditions. And then the last thing that I'll go over is open licensing. That is, open licensing are licenses that grant specific permissions that allow other people to access, reuse, modify, and even redistribute a work in very certain specific ways without infringing the copyright of the rights holder. So open licenses are important to us today because they determine the specific ways that these works can be used by other people, like you and your students. So there's a good reason, or many reasons, why it makes sense for some, but not all, scholarly content to be made open access. And that's to benefit both the creator and end users. So governments provide a lot of funding for research, hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And then public institutions employ a large portion of all those researchers. So researchers publish their findings, and that's generally without the expectation of compensation. Unlike other authors, typically they'll hand over their work to the publishers without payment in the interest of advancing human knowledge, advancing their career, those types of things. And in many cases, they lose their copyright to their work. And that negates their ability to use their own works as they wish for future purposes, or even sometimes to share their work with their colleagues or their students. So once published, those that have contributed to the research, whether those are the researchers themselves, the peer reviewers, all those that supported the research, have to pay again to access the findings. So although research is generally produced as a public good, it's not necessarily available to the public who paid for it, or even sometimes to the authors who created it. So when research is made openly available instead, it becomes accessible and reusable to anybody who can benefit from it. So those might be researchers from institutions or geographic areas that can't afford to pay those high subscription prices for journals, teachers outside of academia, students, even policymakers and journalists. So what's important for us today, particularly for our students, are all of these conversations that are surrounding open access. Students need to be aware that the purpose of creating knowledge isn't to hide it away, where access is pretty limited to only those who can pay for it, but should be readily available to the public, or, in other words, them, when they graduate, if they're not planning to work in academia where they will have access to much of this content. So it's really important that they start to have these conversations around intellectual property and information ownership, as well as the ethics of information access. So you probably know already that students are going to lose access to the resources that the library owns or licenses out when they graduate. But even outside the classroom, these works are going to be necessary in a lot of cases to help students, or graduates, I guess, as they will be, stay informed. And that's whether they become, medical practitioners and need access to the most up-to-date scholarly peer-reviewed literature, entrepreneurs, educators, engineers, or really just generally need that information to navigate life. So really preparing students on how to find, access, and evaluate open access works that are scholarly in nature might have a huge impact on their future, even beyond graduation. So, if you've taught classes and have had students write some sort of research paper, you are probably quite aware that students tend to gravitate towards the web, to Google, rather than the licensed databases through the library. And that's okay, but the question that we have is, how can we go ahead and start teaching them or steering them towards these more reputable scholarly sources that they can access because they have been made publicly available or have been archived in a repository? So one of our jobs as educators, one of our many jobs, of course, is to introduce our students to these reliable open research tools that they can use after they graduate. And we can teach things like proper search strategies for locating openly available research. We can teach them how to evaluate the legitimacy of the information that they do find. And we'll talk about strategies for implementing these lessons. But first, beyond open access publications, there is another method to provide access to lifelong learning, which is to expose your students to open educational resources, or OER. If you haven't heard of these, they're freely available teaching and learning materials that, very similarly to open access publications, have been made freely available and are, again, licensed in a way that allows them to be reused, edited, remixed, customized, basically adapted in the ways that are useful to you as an instructor or to your students. And they can typically be made openly available because, unlike more traditional textbooks, the author who creates these is usually paid something like a stipend or is given a course release up front rather than receiving royalties over time. Or else someone has just created something useful that they think might be helpful to other people. So not only can these be used to teach with in higher education courses, which is how you generally see them used or talked about, but they can also be incorporated directly into classroom activities to help build out these lifelong learners after graduation. So now that you kind of have like a good understanding of what open access and open educational resources are, helping students to use these starts with us knowing how to look for and evaluate these resources. So how do you find them without the help of library licensed databases? There are a ton of places. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them. I do want to talk about a couple, and I'll quickly demo those. Let's see, can you still see my screen? Yes, good. And let me zoom in a little bit here too, to make it easier to see. Okay, So one thing that you can start with, of course, is to introduce your students to Google Scholar. Many of them are probably already using it, but they are likely connected in some way to the university. And so while Google Scholar doesn't provide a way to specifically search out or filter only for open access content, there's still a really good way to find content that is available to individuals, even if they're not affiliated with an institution. So abstracts are almost always free for anybody, but reading the entire article sometimes, like I said, does require a subscription. So if you're looking for a specific topic, or a student is, you could try a few different things. So if I was looking for undergraduate research strategies, I could search that, and there are a lot of different ways, but if I see in a PDF that you have something like TNF Online, we know that these are generally licensed databases, but we can see if there are additional versions, and a lot of times one of these will be from an institutional repository or a subject repository. And that's something that anybody can access. Like, for example, this from a repository in the UK can be accessed by anybody, even if they don't have that connection to USC or another institution. So those are that's a really quick and easy way to find freely available research, although it might not necessarily have open permissions associated with it. Another place that you can go to find open access research is through the Directory of Open Access Journals. This is a community curated directory of, again, open access journals. And you can actually use it to search for specific articles that have been indexed in these peer-reviewed journals. So again, I'm going to search for the same thing, undergraduate research strategies. And I see that there are quite a lot of articles, and of course I can refine my search results, but I can do a couple of things here. I can read that article online, or I could learn more about the journal to give me a little bit more information on how that content is licensed. So for example, I can see that this is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial License, which means I can use it as you know, a student, a graduate, anybody, as long as I'm giving attribution to the original author and I'm not using it for a commercial purpose. So that gives me a lot of license to use this particular article in certain ways. So another place you could go to search for open access content would be the Directory of Open Access Books. It's pretty much the scholarly monograph directory equivalent of the DOAJ, in that it indexes and provides access to scholarly open access books. So if I were, for example, a mathematics instructor in high school and I wanted to brush up on my knowledge without a big budget, I could do something like search for mathematics education, search that, filter and refine it until I found what I was looking for. And so even if I don't have access to, a university library or a big budget, I can still find quality content that has been peer-reviewed and produced by major publishers. That's openly available to me. And then finally, this is the last one I'll show you, but this is a curated collection of open textbooks that are offered through something called the Open Textbook Library. And everything in here is a full original textbook that is openly licensed for you to be able to use in certain ways. And it has to already be either in use or affiliated with some sort of higher education institution. So it's nice because, again, you can go and you can use these in your classroom to teach with, but you can also use them because of the way they've been licensed for classroom assignments as well. So again, if I were somebody who was working in the field of human resources, post-graduation, I could simply search for human resources, find some information that might be relevant for helping me stay abreast of my field, for staying updated and relevant in my job position, or even to refresh myself to get a new position. And I would say, that I have lots of great information here, like the table of contents, again, those conditions of use, and even reviews telling me how others have used this book and whether they find that they are of high quality. So there's a ton more places, of course, like I said, but those are just 4 that are particularly reliable, especially those last 3, since Google Scholar does tend to index more content that hasn't been as closely vetted. But these will essentially guarantee access to content that has been vetted to a certain extent. Although, of course, additional steps should always be taken to evaluate a source's credibility and quality. So that's where you and your students can go to locate content that is free to access and use. So with all this in mind, let's switch over to how you can actually use open access and OER with your students. So quick reminder, generally you're not going to be able to just jump right into using open access in the classroom. You probably are going to need to have some sort of a discussion, or maybe several discussions around intellectual property, the economics and the ethics of scholarship and information access, predatory publishers, maybe if you're focusing on open access, and attribution, all those types of concepts. And those are things that you might be able to outsource to a librarian or to somebody else who's an expert in those fields. But teaching open access in the classroom isn't just going to focus exclusively on open access. Instead, it's going to involve incorporating these open components into your assignments that are already being used, or some new assignments that you might build. And so that could happen in the course of an information literacy instruction module, or even in an introduction to a research or a writing assignment. So a really common technique that we see is to incorporate open access materials into, like I said, some sort of information literacy discussion, typically in advance of assigning a paper or by embedding it directly into a research assignment. So if you're including it in an information literacy module, that's pretty straightforward. Access to this free peer-reviewed content is well worth covering if you are discussing information or digital literacy with your students. But if you want to go a little bit further with that, you might consider requiring 1 or more open access resources in a research paper, or in an assigned literature review or annotated bibliography. That's a nice way to have your students dip their toes in the water and explore searching for and assessing open access literature, but without having to really center it into your curriculum. But if you want to really promote active learning through the use of open access and OER, there are a couple of further techniques that you can use. So one technique would be, again, after having that preliminary discussion, would be to have students locate some piece of open access literature. You can use this database, as I mentioned, and then have them closely examine the license to determine if they can proceed with their intended usage, and then ask them to create some sort of derivative work or a research product that is stemming from that original source. So this is something that they would have permission to do because of the way that the license works, the way that it has given them certain copyright permissions to use the work that they might not have to have with a more traditional piece of literature that they could find in a database. So they might be able to do something like create their own video, or a podcast, or a blog post, or some sort of real life interpretation to transform that literature into something that's more generally appropriate for a public audience. So one example might be they could find an openly licensed public health article, and then they could create an infographic or a video based on that content that would help explain those results to other people in plain language. And then one other thing that they could try would be to even modify, they could enhance, or they could even build out their very own openly licensed resource. So they could maybe, and this kind of sounds like a stretch, but believe it or not, this is done. They could collaboratively publish an open educational resource. They could each publish a short online chapter or build out a website. And one way that they could do that would be to locate, again, a piece of open content, whether that was a piece of open access literature or an OER, and then within that, find some place for improvement or enhancement. So for example, if they found a textbook that they liked, but they didn't find that the case studies were very inclusive, they could add in their own case studies, or they could revise the case studies to make them more diverse. If they wanted to, they could update the content to make it more reflective of a certain geographic language. Or they could go in and even, revise and republish problem areas. Some professors will have their students actually work with open content and then build out their own ancillary materials surrounding these resources. So they could find an open textbook that they liked and then have their students contribute by creating a tutorial, some sort of test bank. And there are a lot of ways to do that. If you're interested, certainly follow up with me. I won't talk too much about it here now for time purposes, but we can always talk about the pedagogy behind collaborative open scholarship and also those practical tools you can use to make it happen. Quickly, I want to show you one example of that just to make it a little bit more real in your mind. This is a open textbook that was actually published by Clemson University undergraduate students. Over the course of a semester, they worked collaboratively to learn about open licensing, copyright, writing for a public audience, all sorts of things that go along with publishing. And then actually each created a chapter within this open access textbook that they then published. And it's actually a really successful book that is being used in other courses. So this is one outstanding example of using open scholarship in the classroom. And not everybody, of course, is going to be able to do something quite that big, but it can certainly be done. So those are just some examples of open access and open education in the classroom, just to kind of get you interested. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to talk about those at the end. But until then, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Stacy, who is going to be talking about open data.
All right, thank you, Amy. That textbook was really, really cool. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about open data in the classroom and other open data related products in the classroom. But I'd like to start by talking a little bit about data literacy. Data literacy can generally be defined as the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. So like literacy generally that we're used to, data literacy focuses on being able to work functionally with data the way that reading literacy focuses on being able to work with the written word. Data literacy is important to all of our students, regardless of what stage of their education they're at. In a 2020 report that was called The Human Impact of Data Literacy, which was conducted on behalf of a group called the Data Literacy Project, it was found that despite the fact that about 87% of business employees know that data is important, only about 25% of surveyed employees feel prepared to use data. And even only about 21% feel confident in data literacy concepts. So it also found that almost half of employees surveyed at these firms worldwide reported frequently making decisions based on gut hunch instead of using available data. So the report that I'm mentioning here, highlights a data literacy skills gap that exists in workplaces around the world. But beyond this, our current students, and that's undergraduate and graduate students, all need data literacy skills to make them informed citizens and good information consumers. We all encounter data and statistics all the time, and as adults, of course, we need to be able to critically evaluate information that we're presented with. We need to be able to understand data in certain environments, and particularly within our own field of study. So, is a data lesson appropriate for your class? And if so, how can you introduce students to data literacy skills that are important in your discipline? And where can you find the data that you might want to show them? So to start off the conversation, I'm going to talk a bit about open data. Some of you may be rather familiar with open data and others perhaps not as much, depending on your field of study. So open data is the idea that some data should be available for public use. I have an official definition for you, and I also don't have a lot of official definitions, but here's one. Open data is digital data that is made available with the technical and legal characteristics necessary for it to be freely used, reused, and distributed by anyone, anytime, anywhere. And that's from a 2015 document called the Open Data Charter. So there's actually a ton of open data available in lots of different places and all disciplines, with more coming all the time. Open data could be data that's created by the government. So in large part, US government data is in the public domain, meaning that it's free of copyright and available for use by members of the public. You might already be aware or be a researcher who uses government data. So for example, lots of researchers use census data or Bureau of Labor and Statistics data or data from some other federal agency in their research. Another source of open data is the research data resulting from federally funded research. So for example, when any of our colleagues, or maybe when one of us, applies to a federal funding agency like the National Science Foundation for research funding, they have to create a plan for how they're going to share not just the resulting published articles, but also the underlying data from their research. And that underlying data composes the data that would be necessary to reproduce the research study. And then they are supposed to follow through with that plan after their research is complete and share that data in an open access data repository. So not all data created by the government or created by researchers who are federally funded get shared, of course. Lots of data are sensitive. They might contain, for example, personally identifying information about study participants or government secrets or some other kind of proprietary information, but there is an ever-increasing amount of data available. So where can this stuff be found? There are thousands of open data repositories around the world. And some of them, like data.gov, which some of us may have heard of before, or data.census.gov, are operated and managed by the United States government or the government of another country, and others are disciplinary. So in many research disciplines, there's a go-to data repository where members of that field share data with colleagues, and there are also institutional data repositories. The University of South Carolina has an institutional repository that's called Scholar Commons, and we don't currently house research data sets in our institutional repository, and that could change sometime in the future, but lots of universities have places where anyone, including you, could go to view and download and reuse research data collected or generated by researchers at that university. So the United States does not currently have a good one-stop federated search platform for research data. Some other countries have experimented with this, and that might be something that will happen in the future. On your slide now, you see a little screen cap of something called re3data.org. If you are looking for open data in any discipline, here's a place you can go to try to find some. So re3data.org is the Registry of Research Data Repositories, and it includes links to repositories, the types of disciplinary types of data accepted, formats accepted, and other important information. And most commonly, or most importantly rather, it takes you to the data repository. If you're someone who's looking for open data sets that you might share with a class, this is a way to get to some of those. If you're looking, if you're looking for some data, this could be a good place to start. I'd like to mention, this is new within the last few years. Google also has a data set search, which is definitely worth trying out. It works pretty well in my experience. It searches across lots of open access repositories. So for example, I'm gonna just type a search term in here. Let's say I'm looking for some science-related data on dendrites. It brings me to different access points for data. So if you're not aware of Google Dataset Search, it works pretty well and is definitely something you should check out. I just go to the search bar and type in Google Dataset Search and it pops up as your first result. If you're looking for data, you can try looking in re3data.org, or you can try the Google Dataset Search, or you can try any other number of means that you are already aware of for finding data in your discipline to share it with your classes. But I wanted to let you know that you can also ask me. So you're going to have our slides. You may already have them, I'm not sure, but you'll definitely have them by the end of this class. And our contact information is located in the slides. So, you know, if you are looking for open data, please contact me and I am happy to help with that. It can be very difficult to locate data that meets specific needs. It can be difficult for someone who's trained and particularly for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with it. So, you know, let me know. And the next thing I'd like to mention to you is some data that is actually not open data. So the University of South Carolina libraries provide access to some data. I'm mentioning this because I think that there might be a lot of people in the session today that don't know this. We do provide access to some data sets for research, and it's not open. We're here to talk about open data. I thought be weird if I didn't mention this, that if you need data for teaching in class or for, you know, your own research purposes, we have some. So for example, the Cross-National Time Series Data Archive, the CNTS archive, is a longitudinal national data series that provides ranges of annual data from 1815 to 2018 for all countries on demographic, social, political, and economic topics. You can download this data and use it for research or teaching purposes. Again, it's not open, free data, but it's free to you, and I just really wanted you to know that we have these and that I want you to think of the library when you think of data. We bought this data set in response to researchers' requests a couple of years ago. And one more thing that I would like to mention back at the slides is that, hey, if you would like to teach using data that isn't free and openly available, like what we're talking about today, oh, yes, I'll be happy. I see a question about navigating to the data sets from the library. Sure, I'm happy to do that. I'll do it in just a moment. If you need access to data that isn't free and openly available for teaching or research, the University of South Carolina Libraries currently has a data procurement pilot. There's still time. It ends March 31st. So in the slides that you're going to get, there's a URL. Visit it and you can read through the requirements. If you have data that you need us to purchase, then for sure fill out the form and we'll see if we can help you get access to that data. And back at, if you go to the library's website, which is sc.edu/libraries, and you click on databases, we've got a lot of databases. If you're someone who hasn't spent a lot of time using university libraries yet, there's a bunch, well over 400. But if you go to all content types, you can pick data and statistics, and that'll get you to those ones that we've purchased. Okay, back to what we're actually here to talk about today. There is some representation in the literature about teaching with open data, and I'm just including in the slides that you're getting a few examples, some citations, so that you'll have them. If you're interested in learning more, by all means, you know, check out these articles or other various books or whatever. I just wanted you to have a few to look at. So although all of our students need data literacy skills, undergraduate and graduate student needs might be a little bit different. So for example, undergraduates are less likely to be working with actual data sets as part of their normal coursework. So, maybe you hear me talk today and you think that maybe you'd like to introduce undergraduates to what data looks like in your discipline, something as simple as that. Or maybe you'd like to help undergraduates learn basic data wrangling skills, or use a common program like Excel to show them how to create a visualization using real data. These are all ideas for how you might interact with students with some of this data that you could potentially find. Appropriate uses of data in your field are going to vary greatly by course and discipline, and as a librarian, I might or might not know what those good uses are. But if you have an idea, or if you're interested in investigating the possibilities, please come talk to me, because I'd like to work with you to put a data-related assignment on your syllabus at any time. So for example, this example isn't working with an undergraduate instructor, it's working with a graduate instructor. But for example, this summer I'm going to be working with a music instructor to incorporate some data management skills into her data analysis for music graduate students course. So these are music students who otherwise might not get a lot of introduction to data management. She has a data analysis course for them, and we're going to work some skills into it. So I'd love to talk to you about your class as well. Or if you're thinking that data literacy skills using open data sounds interesting, but you don't really know where to find the right kind of data or how to create some useful exercises for students, I have another suggestion for you as well. ICPSR is the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. This data repository, which is humongous and has existed since the 1960s, is housed at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. ICPSR is actually the world's largest data repository for social and behavioral research. So if you're in social or behavioral sciences, you've probably heard about ICPSR, but if not, this might be kind of new to you. ICPSR is a consortium of hundreds of research universities and other kinds of organizations, and the University of South Carolina is an ICPSR member institution. And this is good news for us because it means we have access to ICPSR's thousands of studies and educational materials. And I'll say that it's the largest repository for political, social, behavioral research, but they're also branching out and including more data sets from, for example, public health. Now, a lot of these data sets are openly available without restriction, but there are also some restricted data sets. As you can imagine, public health data sets are usually going to have some kind of sensitive data in them. So you can't necessarily access everything in there. But what I wanted to show you today, and the reason that I'm mentioning ICPSR in this classroom or this session full of people from all kinds of disciplines, is that part of their mission is to educate students about data. And so they have some really great ready-made modules specifically designed for undergraduates and their instructors to learn about skills in working with data. I've got a little screenshot up on the screen, and I also have ICPSR. ICPSR, just, put ICPSR in the search bar and it'll come up. You can set up a username and password to use ICPSR. Use your USC email address. I saw there's at least one person here who's from another campus. If you are interested in this, please talk to me afterward. Columbia is a member institution. Other branches may not be. But they have really great classroom exercises already set up. So for example, if you wanted to, well, just explore what's available, here are some of their exercise sets. If you thought investigating community and social capital might be an interesting sounding concept for a class that you're teaching for undergraduates, you can go in there and it'll tell you about the project. You get the data sets that the students can download, and it comes with pre-made exercises. This is a very quick introduction to this within ICPSR. I'll say that If you want to look at these and you're not sure how, contact me after class. Visit ICPSR and take a look for yourself. I also teach workshops on ICPSR, but when you go to ICPSR, again, Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, there are tabs across the top, and you'll find this information under the Teaching and Learning tab. So just an idea. So those are designed specifically for undergraduate students. But while basic data literacy skills are important for, again, undergraduate and graduate students often have a more immediate real-world data needs because they're often actively engaged in collecting and analyzing data. Many graduate students might also be looking for open data to use in their research. As you've seen in the previous slides, there are lots of places where they can look. And you can always refer undergraduate or graduate students to me if they're looking for open data, or if they're looking for data that maybe is not open. I can help people narrow down what their options are. But particularly when you're working with graduate students, some of the training that they might most immediately need is research data management training. So research data management, maybe in its most broad general sense, refers to collecting and storing research data in a way that's going to keep it discoverable and accessible and usable long-term by the researcher or with the people who the researcher shares the data with. And so I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about a few other open data-related products. On the screen, you see Data One and Mantra. So there are some really great online resources out there to help people like graduate students or like researchers who don't have a lot of experience with data management, to help them learn about research data management principles and practices. Data One has some research data management modules that have exercises and slides that people can go through to learn basic data management skills. Mantra is another one, maybe not the highest resolution on my big screen now that I'm looking at it, but the little picture of Mantra that's on this slide is really great because it offers different free, openly available, open source data management education modules based on the kind of person that you are. And what I mean by that is there are modules for information professionals like librarians like me, and there are modules for researchers who have some experience like maybe some of you guys, and there are also modules for research students, so perhaps graduate students that you have working in your lab or who you are advising or working with on their research, their graduate research, that are tailored to that population of person. So a couple of really great places to look online to learn more. And of course, you can also contact me anytime. I'm happy to work with your students one-on-one in the classroom or in small group settings to talk about data management concepts. Data management what is most important in data management can kind of vary by discipline. So if you think that's of interest to you, please contact me and we can get together and talk about it. You might have students at the graduate level who are working with actual data sets. They might be interested in products that can help them manage their data. So I also have a little bit of information here about OpenRefine. So OpenRefine is a free open source data cleaning tool that some of you might already be familiar with. When we are able to do workshops in person, I teach workshops at the library about OpenRefine. So you might have graduate students in the future who are interested in this. But it's free to download, free to use, and it's great for spreadsheet tabular data. And you might also have graduate students who are working with data who might be looking for a place to share some of the products of the research that they're working on. So I've also included a little bit about OSF, that's Open Science Framework. So Open Science Framework is a research collaboration platform and data archive that's free to researchers and can promise to make shared data publicly available for at least 50 years. They give shared data a DOI, which makes it easier to find and easier to cite. And sharing data can increase the likelihood of the researcher, in this case maybe a graduate student, getting cited by others. Or it can also increase opportunities for future collaborations. So I just wanted to, this is not open data per se, but these are all open resources that I wanted to make sure you knew about. So that is my slides for the day. I hope that today's presentation hasn't been overwhelming, because I know it was a lot of information and it went in a few different ways. But I also hope that it brought your attention to just the huge number of open access materials and platforms that are available for you to use in courses and individually with students. Okay, what kind of questions do you guys have for us today? I'll give you a moment to ask, and I'll also just pop our contact information in up here.
Hi, this is Kelly. I have a question. I love the idea of having students contribute to open access resources. And that's, I know, one of the things in my class is that students tell me that they like doing these projects that we're doing, but they wish they could be shared on a wider scale. And so I guess my question, though, is I was really impressed by that Clemson student textbook. But for students in kind of lower level intro classes who might not have that advanced ability to work with material, is there a possibility of doing a smaller scale, like a share open access resources only within the university and not public, to kind of do like trial versions of that?
You know, that's a good question, and one of those things that I like to talk a lot about when I'm discussing creating these types of open projects with students are things like, you know, student agency and the risk that students might have when they're putting that type of information out there. And a lot of those things, again, revolve around their intellectual property, their comfort levels with making the things that they produce in the, you know, the course of a class available, you know, for the long term. And those are some tricky questions, really, because you have to consider things like, you know, FERPA and all that good stuff as well. But a couple of things that seem to work well in those cases are to have students either participate, you know, openly, but either anonymously or under a pseudonym, or even provide like full class attribution rather than attributing specific portions of content to students. So that's one way that people tend to get around that, a little bit of that discomfort that students might have when really putting their work out there in the broader public sphere. But in terms of licensing, you know, there are ways that they could certainly produce content and maintain it under a more traditional copyright, under, you know, traditionally licensed or copyrighted terms rather than openly licensed. And that's something that happens automatically, of course. Anything that's like minimally creative and has been fixed in some, you know, tangible form does receive copyright. So if a student wanted to produce something, or a class wanted to put something together and not put it out there on the broader scale, that's something that they could do and just not put it on the public web, you know, keep it within Blackboard or share it amongst themselves. But if you do assign a public license to it, you know, one of those Creative Commons licenses, that really is going to make it more accessible to anyone, even if it's kept behind some sort of like paywall or LMS, and that somebody could essentially share it out. And there's a little bit more risk around that, I believe. So there's a lot of, I feel like I've kind of rambled on here, but there are a lot of factors to consider, and I'm happy to follow up and talk more with you about that if you want to reach out to me and we can chat about it one-on-one. But all that is to say, once you openly license it, it's openly licensed. So it might not be a good idea if you don't feel that the students are ready for something of that scale. But they could still work on a collaborative project.
Okay, great, thanks.
Sure.